speaking of terrible people, one of them sits in the governor's mansion up in Maine. And the fact that LePage could be elected, and granted it was a three-way race twice, anywhere in a country where, I don't know, they have free elections, should have been a sign that there's a problem in this country. Here is Governor Paul LePage from Maine defending Confederate monuments.
As for those monuments that some argue would honor them, I guess that's where we hit the First Amendment, and that's where there is some disagreement.
Well, you know, I take a look at Robert E. Lee, for instance, and all the hoopla about Robert E. Lee. You know, whether we like it or not, he was one of the greatest generals of his time, and both the Union and the Confederate wanted him to lead their armies. I mean, and his choice was, I want to fight for my state. He was a big states' right general. He had nothing against the United States government, but he believed the states should be more powerful than the federal government. And in fact, our founders intended that to be the case.
And in his memoirs, he actually talked about how painful it was for him to make that decision and serve the Confederacy. And it basically came down to the fact that it was his kith and kin and his home that he was fighting for, not necessarily his ideology when it came to slavery.
Yeah, and what was the war? If you really truly read and study the Civil War, it was turned into a battle for the slaves. But initially, I mean, 7,600 Mainers fought for the Confederacy, and they fought because they were concerned about, they were farmers, and they were concerned about their land, their property. It was a property rights issue. As it began, the President of the United States, who was a very brilliant politician, really made it about slavery to a great degree.
All right, let's just examine
like
this.
Lincoln.
Yeah, and somebody's also just lying. Now, I don't want to make this argument from a perspective of authority, but I'll remind you that Governor LePage had to be talked down by his own attorneys because he was meeting with sovereign citizens, people from sovereign citizen groups on a regular basis who were telling him that he had the right to assassinate his political enemies and that the true seat of power in Maine was with the county sheriffs. And there literally had to be an intervention by his own attorneys to get him to stop meeting with these people because they were wrong. CNN spoke to some experts on some of the questions that LePage raised. Jamie Kingman Rice, who is the director of the library service at the Maine Historical Society, said that LePage's 7,600 people figure for Mainers that fought in the Confederacy, quote, is not a number that is known to the research community. That's what you say if you are the director of the Maine Historical Society and know that the governor may have some influence on your budget. Instead of saying, that's the nuttiest, that guy's an effing whack job, you simply say, that's not a number that's known to anybody who studies any of these numbers.
That might be still enough to enrage this governor.
Oh, yeah. If he can figure out, like, if he can decode
sentence,
that.
Matt.
Yeah. David Blight, a Civil War historian and a professor at Yale, said it was doubtful that more than a handful of Mainers fought for the Confederacy. The state of Maine was one of the strongest supporters of the Union. The professor also said the idea that the Civil War was initially a conflict over land was, quote, patented nonsense. It's appalling degree of ignorance and misinformation by a governor of a New England state, or any state for that matter, he said. He said this war was rooted in the problem, racial slavery and its expansion, and the ways in which that issue tore apart the American political system and then tore apart the Union. And to say the war was only of interest of farmers worried about their property rights is beyond ridiculous in the 21st century. Matthew Karp, who is a Civil War historian at Princeton University, said, the idea that Maine was a Confederate hotbed is ludicrous. I have no idea what LePage is talking about. Quote, in the 1860 presidential election, the Southern Democratic candidate John Breckinridge couldn't even get 7,600 votes in Maine. Lincoln won over 62% of the vote. Maine furnished over 70,000 troops for the Union, including 9,000 who died during the Civil War. Karp went also said there was no doubt that property rights played an important role in the cause of the Civil War. Because, quote, as lots of historians have pointed out recently, the property value of South slaves was somewhere around $3 billion, more than all the banks, factories, and railroads in the North combined. Slaveholders believed their right to human property was enshrined in the Constitution. So LePage is just making things up, or things that he heard from, like, lunatics that he allows into his office. And
Such
he's
as himself.
still governor, yes.
It's a self-assessment right there. Lunatics that are allowed in the governor's office begin with the governor. It's extraordinary. I mean, that he... And let it be another cautionary lesson, right? That, I mean, not only can they get elected, but, I mean, you already said this essentially, but, like, reelected and never have to resign no matter what they say, no matter how unhinged, racist, whatever.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL, and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos